Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Chapter 6 lecture on attitudes and persuasion. In this chapter, we're going to focus on things like how attitudes develop and whether and how attitudes come to predict and influence behavior. So in this section, we'll be answering a couple questions, such as what are their attitudes and how are they measured? How are they formed and what factors influence them? Also, how can attitudes be changed and how do attitudes predict behavior? Of course, we're going to be curious about what are the different types of persuasion and, of course, how can persuasion be used to change attitudes? So we'll go ahead and get started with section 1 as we identify and measure what attitudes are. So we'll start with the terminology. What is an attitude specifically? Social psychologists often refer to an attitude as a person's evaluation of almost any aspect of the world. They're relatively enduring and range in strength from negative to positive. Think of attitudes like mental shortcuts. They help us navigate the world, and they're formed through our experiences, our beliefs, and our emotions. For instance, think about your favorite brand of coffee. Your positive attitude towards it might be based on its taste or the brand's value, or even the feeling you get when you hold that warm mug in your hands. And we can understand attitudes through the CAB model, which is cognitions, affect, and behavior. And as it's applied to attitudes, of course, it has these three components. Cognitive component is about thoughts. So it's what a person thinks about, such as the attitude towards the object. For instance, tigers are big old scary carnivores that eat humans. The affective component refers to the feelings. And so this is the emotions associated with the attitude. So based on our thoughts about this target, the tiger, therefore I am scared of the tiger. And then behavioral component is the third, and this is about the experiences. So it's about how a person behaves or acts in relation to the attitudes of the object. So needless to say, if I see a big ass tiger, I would fear for my life and possibly try to, preserve my life in some way. I don't know if it's running or climbing or playing dead or what. So how does the CAB model help us to analyze attitudes? Well, beyond strength and degree of favorability, attitudes can exist at varying levels of awareness. Implicit attitudes are unconscious evaluations of people, groups, or objects. They're formed through our experiences and the messages we receive from our environment, and they can influence our behavior without us even being aware of it. And these are generally automatic. For instance, say you have an implicit negative attitude towards people with disabilities. This means that you may unconsciously associate people with disabilities with negative words or concepts, such as being weak or helpless. Explicit attitudes are conscious evaluations of people, objects, or groups. And they are the attitudes that we are aware of and that we can report on with deliberate intentionality. As before, if you have an explicit positive attitude towards people with disabilities, this means that you consciously believe that people with disabilities are valuable and should be treated equally and fairly. Now, measuring explicit attitudes on non-controversial topics such as preferences for certain foods or favorite hobbies is often straightforward. People are generally comfortable sharing their opinions on these subjects, and self-report methods like surveys and questionnaires, these can effectively capture their attitudes. However, when it comes to controversial topics, the task becomes significantly more challenging. Individuals may be hesitant to disclose their true feelings due to social desirability bias, which is the fear of judgment, or the sensitive nature of the topic. And this is where the complexities of measuring attitudes come into play. So, how do we actually go about measuring these attitudes? It's not like we can just pull out a ruler and measure someone's liking for a political candidate. We need different tools for different purposes. And social psychologists measure attitudes in a variety of ways, but the most common method is to use self-report measures. Self-report measures are questionnaires or interviews that ask people to report on their own attitudes. One common type of self-report measure is the Likert scale. And these are made up of a series of statements about the attitude of the object and the person is asked to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with each statement. For example, a Likert scale to measure attitudes towards climate change might include statements such as, I believe that climate change is real, or I believe that humans are causing climate change. And social psychologists also use a variety of other methods to measure attitudes, including behavioral observations. And this involves observing people's behaviors to infer their attitudes. For example, a researcher might observe how long people spend looking at different political advertisements to infer their attitudes towards the candidates running for office. Physiological measures involve measuring the physiological responses, such as a heart rate or skin conductance, or measuring the person's breathing patterns. For instance, a researcher might actually assess something like a heart rate while participants are watching a video of maybe about social issues to assess their level of emotional engagement with the issue. There's also projective attitude measures, and these include things like Rorschach ant blot test or the thematic appreciation test. And these aim to assess individuals' unconscious thoughts, feelings, and attitudes by presenting them with ambiguous stimuli and asking them to project their thoughts onto those stimuli. Interpretation of responses can be subjective and require specialized training. And there's also implicit measures, and these involve measuring people's attitudes without them being consciously aware of it. And one common implicit measure is the implicit association test, known as the IAT. And this measures how quickly people associate positive and negative words with different groups of people. Now, the best method, excuse me, the best method for measuring attitudes will depend on the specific research question that the social psychologist is trying to answer. For instance, if a researcher is interested in measuring people's explicit attitudes towards a particular social issue, then a self-report measure such as the Likert scale would be appropriate. However, if the researcher is interested in measuring people's implicit attitudes towards a particular social group, then an implicit measure such as the IAT might be more appropriate. But to navigate the challenges associated with measuring sensitive or controversial topics, researchers must employ more sophisticated methods that can uncover implicit attitudes and provide deeper understanding of the underlying beliefs and biases. A great example of navigating these complexities is presented in the 2024 study titled Ideological Connections, an integrated humanistic social psychological approach to examining the relationship between controversial opposing opinions. In the study, the author asked, how do ideological views align based on the values and identity characteristics of the holder? And they used a gamified self-report survey to explore the relationship between controversial ideologies. So the author investigated the relationship between these across 4 different categories that included political, social, health and medical, and safety, security, and legal ideologies. And within each of these categories, the author examined opposing viewpoints, such as being liberal versus being conservative, or pro-choice versus pro-life, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, being pro-choice versus pro-life, supporting the border wall or opposing the border wall. And the list goes on. There were 17 critical factors. And the survey had a gamified approach, masking as a this or that game. So kind of think of it like that F, Marry, Kill game where you have to select one between the 3, or this was select one between the 2. And it intended to measure the explicit and implicit attitudes as the critical questions were mixed into the larger survey that asked about several other non-critical fun factors, such as things like what's your pet preference between cat and dog, or what's your personality type between introvert versus extrovert, or even funner things like if you had to pick Team Edward versus Team Jacob, or pick your favorite beach spot, beach versus mountains, and so on. And so with this research, the author found a significant alignment in ideologies that suggest that one can predict a person's preferences simply based on 1 or 2 ideological points. And this study provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the complexities of measuring attitudes, especially in polarized contexts. It highlights the importance of considering both explicit and implicit attitudes in research and offers valuable perspectives for designing studies that measure attitudes towards controversial topics. And so think on it for a minute. What are your thoughts? Do you think a study like this could legitimately measure people's attitudes? So let's recap what we've covered in this first section on identifying and measuring attitudes. We started by defining attitudes as learned predispositions that influence our thoughts and behaviors. And these predispositions are formed through our experiences and develop from our opinions. The CAB model provides a helpful framework for understanding the different components of attitudes: cognitive, affective, and behavioral. And we also explored the distinction between implicit and explicit attitudes, where implicit attitudes are those unconscious associations, while explicit attitudes are consciously accessible and easier to report. And to measure these different types of attitudes, researchers employ a variety of methods, including self-reports, observational measures, physiological responses, projective measures, and implicit tests. And we've also examined my 2004 study, which provides a compelling example of how a mixed methods approach can be used to investigate attitudes towards controversial ideologies. And by understanding the different ways we can measure attitudes, we can gain a deeper understanding of how they influence our thoughts, behaviors, and interactions with the world around us. Be sure to check back in for section 2 as we'll discuss attitude formation and adjustment.